At the helm of social change and academic excellence sits Dr. Marcus Anthony Hunter, the esteemed Scott Waugh Endowed Chair in the Social Sciences Division and a distinguished professor of Sociology and African American Studies at UCLA. As the visionary coiner of the transformative hashtag Black Lives Matter, Dr. Hunter's influence transcends academia, igniting global conversations on racial equity. Fresh off the heels of the State of the People Power Tour and during the second annual National Equity Week, we have today's guest, Dr. Marcus Anthony Hunter. This is the Black Information Network Daily Podcast, and I'm your host, Ramses Ja. All right, Dr. Hunter, welcome to the show. How you doing today, man?
I'm blessed in the city, as Fred Hammond says, peace and gratitude for you. Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. So do us a favor, for folks that don't know about your work just yet. I've given you a little bit of an introduction, but, talk about who you are, the work you've done, and sort of what led you to kind of the position you hold in the conversation we're about to have today.
Yeah, I've been a student my whole life of the Black experience. I grew up in a Black household in South Philly, where, if there was something Black excellent happening, we were a fan of it. So there were two Black girls with braids and beads playing tennis and whipping people. We were tennis fans. Debbie Thomas was twirling and ice skating. We were ice skating fans. And so in that kind of incubator of Blackness, it then meant when I went out into the world and started to pursue my education, I really centered the Black experience. I wanted to be curious about my own people and about my community. And that led me down a very interesting adventure, which includes like formal school, but also just taking me to places near and far. So how I come into the reparative justice reparations space is really through Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. So my first book and dissertation followed the neighborhood he studied in the Philadelphia Negro. So that book is 1899. I went and basically asked, what happened after Du Bois left, and I looked at that same neighborhood over the 20th century, and I found that a lot happened, including the invention of public housing. There were Black banks, and those Black banks took me down a path of, whoa, I didn't know there were Black banks in 1920 something. And as I went down that journey, I discovered the Freedmen's Bank, which was established right before Abraham Lincoln was assassinated at the end of the Civil War. And it had upwards of $1 billion of Black people's money after being founded in 1865. By 1871, over $1 billion in today's money. 1874, it abruptly closes and had Frederick Douglass as the manager, who had also put $10,000 worth of his own money in there. And that made me think about reparations really differently, because up until that point, I heard the 48 Years and a Mule, shout out to Spike Lee and General Sherman. But when I read about the Freedmen's Bank and I started to study it, which, by the way, for all of the folks who are listening, those records are being held by the Mormon Church. The Church of Latter-day Saints holds those records, which I find fascinating. But I then thought, well, we're always talking about promises made versus money we actually had. And that was our first money, when you were actually able to actually really be paid, especially military folks. And once I got there, I thought, how can I understand this concept? Where does it need to take me? So I found myself in Jamaica and Barbados and Ghana and South Africa and the United Kingdom and France and South Carolina and Georgia and Oklahoma to kind of figure out how we as a people got from one place to the next place. And then in the midst of that journey, one day I was sitting home and a 202 number called me. And I looked at the area code and I'm thinking 202, that looks like IRS, and that looks like student loan. I don't want to talk to any of them. And now today it might look like ICE, so I really don't want to answer this call. But the spirit said, Marcus, answer the phone call. I answered the call, and when I say hello, it is then Congresswoman, now first Black woman mayor of Oakland, Barbara Lee, on the phone. And she says, I'm calling to speak to Professor Marcus Hunter. She saw me on C-SPAN Book TV moderate a panel on slavery, and she thought it was really good. She wanted me to know. And then she said she was developing legislation that would complement H.R. 40, which is the legacy reparations bill in Congress, with a bill called Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation, modeled off of the South Africa Truth and Reconciliation. And she asked if I was available. And then she asked if I would help draft it. And then she introduced it. And then she asked me to help her build a coalition. And then the whole story unfolds from there.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, thank you for that. One of the things that I think that it's important to share with you and with our listeners is that I learned how dynamic and profound a speaker you actually are this past weekend in Los Angeles at the State of the People Power Tour. And we were invited there by Joy Reid and Dr. Johns, right? And so when we first got in to the building, there was a gymnasium. I'm not sure how much of this stuff you remember, but when we first got,
I remember you in the front. Yes, as you said, the whole face, everything.
Okay, exactly. Okay, so we were sitting in the front, right? And because we kind of have a little bit of familiarity with Dr. Johns, he's been on the show before. We knew what he was bringing to the table. The same with Joy, Angela. It was, a lot of this was kind of like, okay, these are people that we've looked up to. But that day we met a new hero. We're meeting right now for the first time. So met is a strong word, but we were introduced, I'll say, to a new hero. And that's you. And your position was firmly on here's reparations, here's why we need reparations, here's how reparations can impact our plight. This is where reparations fits into the overall puzzle of Black people's story in America. And, with the type of show that we make, we've had reparations conversations before, and we do understand the, sort of the gravity of reparations just as a subject, and the impact that it can have. But never before had we had the opportunity to bear witness to someone who was so deep in the weeds on it and was able to articulate it in such a way that it was almost a no-brainer. It's felt like a fight before, and this is no disrespect to anyone who's come on before, because I recognize that it is a fight. But when you put the data with it, when you put how it makes sense for the country and for us, it was a no-brainer. And we how it was backstage there, and when Kamala Harris came, and the fruit of Islam and everyone holding court, and then we have to film our documentary piece to cameras back there. So we didn't get a chance to actually talk. So when I saw you on the schedule and Chris introduced, your name to the conversation, you don't know this, but I hit back absolutely, because that was our plan initially, and it just kind of happened to come together this way. So I know that I've talked around the State of the People Power Tour, and you're our first guest on. From there, in hindsight, and I didn't mean to get in front of you, but do us a favor for our listeners. Talk about the State of the People Power Tour, what it meant, what's happening moving forward with that, and then we'll shift gears and talk about Equity Week, because I want to get to that as well.
Yeah, no, first, God bless you. Thank you so much for not only what you're doing, but also just for the amount of loving water you just poured into me. I just want to,
of course,
I can say thank you so much. The State of the People Power Tour, shout out to Angela Rye, and all of the people, because effectively the idea is to go through multiple cities across the United States and tap in with the community to have both a sort of town hall community style conversation, but also give people what they need on the ground. What are people's needs? And bring a collection of people who are working in all sorts of ways, but bring people together in the same synergistic space so that we can see what the state of our condition is, and really centering people in that conversation and in that experience. And so when we were in Los Angeles, which was the final stop of the first leg of the power tour for the State of the People, we were also launching several of the Black papers. And so for folks listening in, the Black papers are the scholarly policy complement to the rest of the activations happening through the State of the People, led by Dr. David Johns. It is a curation of papers that are intentionally called Black papers, because traditionally policy papers are referred to as white papers. And so the idea was to center Blackness even in the name of those papers. And they cover a range of topics from housing to reproductive justice to education, economics. And on the day that we were all together, we were launching also the Reparations Black paper. And one thing that's, I think, really important about the Black papers is, as Dr. Johns would say, is something that your mama, your grandmama, your auntie, your cousin, you don't need a high school degree, you don't need a diploma, you don't need a college degree, you don't need to do homework in order to show up and experience the Black paper. They're filled with solutions, strategies, and something I also share with the group there is I like to see everything that Black people do as explicit and subversive. It just goes back to me to being enslaved. You're explicitly, accomplishing the free labor that is being asked of you, but you're also subversively putting braids in people's hair that shows them a map to how to get out of this. So the subversive aspect of the State of the People Black papers is also that it's a Rolodex, an index of workers, warriors, fighters, advocates who you may not otherwise know, but they're all listed because all of them are collaborative. So I also see them as a place you can go and say, I'm really trying to figure out what I can get resources on around reproductive justice. Here are the names, at the top of the actual paper and in the brain trust listing and in the citations in a way that is super accessible. And so what I think about that whole initiative, and this is something I also said to Ange personally, is that she could be doing so many things. Sure. And she's from the center of her heart doing this voluntarily, and then having a list of people who could be doing other things show up voluntarily as well. And I think at a time when thin gas is at an all-time high, poverty is at an all-time high, Black maternal mortality is at an all-time high, that to have people come together and be with people and recognize that as long as we have us, we got a lot, and I think that's one of the major takeaways of the State of the People Power Tour is that you see us in Atlanta, us in Baltimore, us in LA as we were, that you start to see us, St. Louis, there's a lot of us. And I think in a time when people are trying to figure out what's next, being able to be rooted in the usness is very powerful.
Yeah. And just to echo that, Q, the co-host for this show, who was on the ground with me there, he was fortunate enough to make it to the Detroit stop and to LA with me. Or I should say I made it to LA with him. And he was having a conversation backstage with Jamel Hill. Their friends are both from Detroit. So I got a chance to overhear a bit of that. Jamel's been on the show, of course, as well. And she's a friend of ours. But listening to them kind of recap the importance of that, I cannot stress to our listeners enough, if there's a way to get involved, if the tour stops anywhere near you, it is energizing in a time when there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of concern about our future as a people, our political plight, the plight of our day-to-day lives, who is coming to serve and protect our community. What are their intentions? Who's representing us? Who are our elected officials, and how much of our plight is something that they're cognizant of? This is an event that helps ease a lot of the concern, because there's strategy. It's not easy, but there's strategy. There's things that you can implement. There's things that you can be made aware of. There's initiatives that you should be made aware of that are concerning, deeply concerning. But none of this comes without strategy. None of this comes without Black brilliance. None of this comes without Black excellence. And to be informed about the goings on in your community and in the country, and specifically with respect to the plight of Black people, is the best tool that you will have in your arsenal, that information. And the best way to receive that information is, as you mentioned, in an environment where everyone's there to love on each other and to pour energy into each other and to inform each other. And, everyone's goals are aligned. So, I implore you listening, just check it out again. State of the People Power Tour. That's PPL, State of the PPL. If you want to look that up on any social media or online. All right. So let's move on, because what's going on right now is Equity Week in DC, and we should be there on the ground, but it didn't quite work out for this time. I think we're going to do something in Baltimore with Dr. Johns, but this week didn't quite work out for us. But you're there. So talk to us about Equity Week, what it means, what's going on, and what people can expect if they're able to attend either in person or virtually.
Absolutely. So we had our inaugural Equity Week last year. Mm-hmm. Equity Week was born out of, so when Mr. Floyd, also known as George Floyd, Miss Breonna Taylor, lost their lives, we were told we were in a racial reckoning. And I mentioned the Honorable Barbara Lee earlier. She was a part of a collaboration of members in Congress that were introducing legislation like the Truth, Racial Healing Transformation Bill, HR 40. Then we had the George Floyd Policing Reform Bill that then member, now Mayor Karen Bass introduced. We had the Voting Rights Act that then became the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. Mm-hmm. Have the third Reconstruction Bill, which is Reverend Barber's Poor People Campaign signature anti-poverty legislation. And what was happening is that there was a lot of energy around what all of us were doing. And for folks who don't know, usually when there's a policy, there's a work group that's behind that policy. Of course, there's the member that you see, but there's a collection of individuals that form a coalition that are calling for co-sponsorship, that are, meeting with journalists and trying to get that moved up the hierarchy and the food chain of policy. And after about 2.5 years of advocating for this with the Biden-Harris administration, I started to notice that none of us were getting anything. So the John Lewis Voting Rights Act had been moved to HR 1, which means that it's the number one priority in the House of Representatives. It was not becoming law. We see HR 40 getting to 200 plus co-sponsors not getting on the floor for a vote. We had Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation, major PSAs circulating. Shout out to Beyonce, shout out to Quavo, shout out to Keke Palmer and Alicia Keys. And then we have faith leaders, Reverend Wallace, and so many other people, sojourners. We had activists, shout out to Mark Lamont Hill and Salamisha Tillett and Scheherazade Tillett, do PSAs that were getting millions of views. And we still were not getting the legislation or executive action. And so what I started to notice is that when we would have our meetings, the administration would say, well, if we did the Truth Commission, how would this work with third Reconstruction? If we did HR 40, how would this work with the Voting Rights Bill? And so that's kind of pitting everybody against each other, when in fact, I believe, and I think all of us who are working in the space believe and know that Black people and the American people have earned a buffet of options, not just to have to pick from one or the other thing. And so the thought for me was, what if we started combining forces? What if we had the members who represent these bills show up and do a joint congressional briefing where here is a slate of equity and reparative justice legislation, including the Restoring Artistic Protections Act that then Congressman Jamal Bowman and current Congressman Hank Johnson were leading on behalf of the Black Music Action Coalition, shout out to Prophet. And part of what we did was, rather than us fight individually, what if we have that slate? And then what if we create an opportunity to bring people from across the country to DC? And what is that final week in June before Juneteenth, before they go into recess? And so it's a series of events. One of the main things is called Out on the Hills, a signature event of the National Black Justice Collective, where right now, as I'm out here, thanks to support from UCLA, I was able to bring 30 students from UCLA. They flew in yesterday to come for Equity Week. I had 19 last year. And they're up right now at the Capitol with meetings all day long where they're going across Democrat and Republican offices to advocate for these policies that are about reparative justice and equity. And at the time when we started, equity wasn't then a bad word. Now it's become public enemy number one. And I think that's an important time to triple down on the term and the effort. Tomorrow night on Friday at Howard Theater from 9 p.m. to 1 a.m., we have the Equity Ball, which is a way to bring in what I affectionately call the alphabet community, but the LGBTQIA plus SGL community, because part of my understanding and my understanding as a student of history is that Bayard Rustin, who is a part of the alphabet community, was at the forefront of organizing the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, but is often forgotten and not remembered as the anchor that he was. Ella Baker is often not remembered. Pauli Murray, not remembered. Like, there are a lot of people who don't get remembered, but importantly, when people see the March on Washington, they're allowed to look at all of those people and think, everybody there is straight. They're all straight people. We're not there. But we are. And so the idea behind the ball was to have a ball that centers the community and brings them into DC alongside advocacy. And then we culminate on Saturday, where we do a ceremonial freedom walk around the perimeter of the reflecting pool at the Lincoln Memorial. And for folks who are listening, I want people to understand something that is very spiritually important. And that is that water carries memory. And what does that then mean? It means that reflecting pool that has been the epicenter for so many of our movements, whether it be the Million Man March or the March on Washington and every other demonstration in between, that water is carrying the memory of people who came there looking to try to make America fulfill its obligation to be what it says that it is. And so our goal, what we do is we get local African drummers out of DC. They lead us in a procession that starts off a little solemn because we do an invocation of the ancestors. We pour a little water libation and gratitude. And then we basically, by the end of that lap, we look like a second line in Louisiana and New Orleans during Mardi Gras, because we are uplifting them. And in this climate, I think it's even more important. So we'll be the first people allowed in. We're going in at 12 p.m. from 12 to 1 at the Lincoln Memorial Reflecting Pool. We'll have our procession around, and it effectively is a combination of Palo Santoing that water and saging it at the same time, because soon after we depart, a lot of potential foolishness and craziness and anti-Blackness and anti-Africanness might be showing up behind us, and we want that water, that sacred water, that sacred location, to be protected and to be acknowledged and recognized for holding the possibilities and memories that have been before it.
Again, well stated. One of the things that I know, just to kind of provide some support to what you're saying, is I might have been 18, 17, something like that. And I saw this film called What the Bleep Do We Know? Now, this gets into kind of like quantum mechanics and, all that sort of stuff. But in the film, there's an experiment that it's a documentary. So they cover an experiment done by a gentleman named Dr. Emoto. And basically he took like some water from a river and he thought, okay, what if I put a label on this water and just check it against itself? So he has some control water where he doesn't label it. Then he has some water and he has someone pray over the water. There's like a monk that gave it a blessing or something like that. Then there's water and he labels it and he writes, I hate you, I'm going to kill you. And he does all these different, puts all this different energy out there to the water, right? So it sounds crazy. Then they show the results of the experiment and you can see the water that received the blessing. It looks all beautiful and like crystal like. The water that says, I love you too, and it has the I love you label. It has just this beautiful shape to it. And the water that he says, I hate you too, it like has this sort of cancerous, like bubbly sort of, when you get it under a microscope and all the rest of it, right? So he's showing like how intentionality can affect water. And then the supposition is that, because we're made of water, that intentionality, words, language, thoughts, etc., could affect, our being. So it's interesting that you say that about the water in DC and all the history that's taken place there, and that you're taking the time to reestablish some intentionality out there. and you're taking it to the water where the memories are held. So I kind of love that. Another thing that you mentioned too, and this is going to be a part of the conversation we're going to have. So now is as good a time to get there as any. Equity.
Yeah.
When it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, I've heard a couple of times that the defense, the collective defense, I'll call it, from let's say the right, these people who now newly oppose diversity, equity, and inclusion. These people who have turned their back on it, or these people that always opposed it. Mm-hmm. The collective defense, the common defense, is that they don't have a problem with diversity. Mm. I would push back against that, but they don't want that label. So they'll say, look, diversity, not a problem. Mm-hmm. Okay. Inclusion is kind of the other side of that coin. Mm. So they'll say, inclusion, well, nothing to see here. We love inclusion. Mm-hmm. I don't think that they do. Mm-hmm. But they can't say that. So what's the vulnerable part there? It's equity, right? Mm-hmm. So to your point, equity is now the new bad word. Mm-hmm. And that's the point of attack that people that oppose diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, that's what they center on, so that they don't seem like monsters. Because when you say it all out, when you say it all fully, diversity, equity, and inclusion, who would be opposed to that in the United States of America in 2025, right? So again, they hyper focus on equity, and they suggest that equity is somehow unfair, and equity is the most fair, right? They suggest that equity only focuses on the outcomes. Mm-hmm. When indeed equity focuses on every single step along the way. Mm-hmm. And if every step along the way is equitable, then the outcomes should naturally be equitable, right? Mm-hmm. Given that, our presumption is that all human beings, all Homo sapiens are more or less capable of achieving the same things, right? And this needs to be borne out over longer periods of time than 2021 to 2024-ish, late 2024. It needs a longer time to right itself, because there was hundreds of years for this to end up where it is, right? So equity addresses those hundreds of years. And, I think that whenever I bring to people's attention the monopoly experiments, which is something you may or may not be familiar with, but in short for our listeners, there were these scientists studying human behavior. They had people play Monopoly and flipped a coin. Whoever won the coin toss, that person was going to be able to play the full game of Monopoly. They passed go. They got $200. They got to roll both dice. They got to buy all the property, etc. And the person who lost the coin toss was only going to get $100 for pass and go, had to wait to buy property, got half the money up front, and could only roll one of the dice. So they were playing with a handicap. Mm-hmm. And naturally, the person that got to play the full game was able to win. Mm-hmm. But after going around the board, 4 or 5 times, then they said, okay, well, now both of you get to roll both dice. Mm-hmm. And both of you get $200 when you pass go. And both of you can buy property at the same rate or whatever. And then the person who had the head start still won, right? So equity goes back and says, okay, what did you get? Mm-hmm. Take some of that, make sure that everyone's playing the same game, and now you guys both have a chance at owning something. But equality says, oh, well, you guys just both roll the same dice and you both get $200 pass and go. And then this other person's still going to win. So when the person who won the coin toss holds everyone else to his standard, then of course it looks like everyone else is failing, right? And the only way to right that wrong is with equity, not with equality, because equality says, okay, well, you have access to the same game that I have access to. But if the schools have been redlined and the community that you come from lacks the resources that privileged communities have, if your fathers have been taken out of the home, not because they're not good fathers. I think the CDC established clearly that Black men are the best fathers overall from any race. But when fathers are taken out of the home from a failed carceral system, when families are broken up because of any number of things that take place in the society. Now that we're seeing this happen to our Hispanic and Latino brothers and sisters, when families are broken up, communities suffer. Right? You mentioned maternal health rates. We haven't talked about environmental justice, environmental racism. We haven't talked about the war on drugs. We haven't talked about the GI Bill and how that was, you mentioned Freedmen's Bank. So, that plus many other instances of people actually taking Black wealth from Black people has meant that we have never been able to even get a proper footing in this country. So, equity. Yeah. Discuss how today's anti-DEI political climate mirrors, past errors of backlash, and what it will take to move this country forward with truth, repair, and policy.
Absolutely. First of all, let's just give it up for Professor Ramsey. I mean, these listeners, you just gave a whole curriculum right there. Okay. Even having to follow that. Okay. Let me just got to give it up for the professor.
I got some people that inspire me.
That was exceptional. Okay.
Thank you, sir.
You already know to your point. First, let's just start with the word, because I love words. You cannot spell equality without the word equity. So we are starting with equality. We're already starting from a place of disadvantage because we're trying to spell a bigger word without having the root word intact.
Sure.
So this is why all of that unfolds in the way that it does. The other thing is, just recently I was in the United Kingdom for editorial board meeting for a journal that I'm on. And they have, because they invented the colonies, we always have like a, father, grandfather relationship between these two countries. And they have a similar thing, but they call it EDI, which I think is really interesting, that they call it equity, diversity, and inclusion. They put equity first. And it has not received the same level of attack that it has in America, which is interesting because like in the past, the British ended slavery and we continue to love it. The America continued to do it, even though the British bequeathed slavery to the United States, so that part is always fascinating where the progenitor is moving in a certain direction, but its offspring is still being very stubborn about something that they should be off of at this particular point. And that still continues today. I think on the issue of equity, it goes down just like you said, where it's about getting back to the fundamental starting place. Even in the legislation, one of the pieces that we're doing, Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation, it comes out of the mind and vision of Dr. Gail Christopher. When she was a leading vice president at the Kellogg Foundation, she spearheaded an evaluation of the 40 plus countries that had done a truth and reconciliation or reparations process. And what she found was in the United States context, the word reconciliation is not appropriate because reconciliation is about we started somewhere equal. And then that got, distorted along the way. Okay. There's nowhere to go back to have that conversation. So all we can do is heal and transform. And so that gets back to even what equity means. I think also one of the dilemmas about all of these policies is that as Black people, we have been told that things like affirmative action or DEI are ways to address our experience, that they're born out of our experience, except time and again, when we look at the beneficiaries, it tends to be white women.
White women, yeah.
Right? And then when we look at people who are voting for political operatives who are anti that, tends to be white women. White women also give birth to these entities called white men. And so there's this way that white women continue to hedge their livelihoods and their bets off of the experience of oppressed and marginalized people to get benefits for themselves, while also then giving birth to and facilitating mindsets that will continue to oppress and marginalize those people. So that's the very interesting dynamic that hinges on the fact that white women themselves did not vote in mass for Hillary Clinton. So they have a mirror problem. There's something going on there. And there's also this convenience of being able to be mad at the very system, but you continue to procreate that same system. Sure. So that's one of the dilemmas, is that white women as a class have to have, I often call it white Thanksgiving with each other, where they start to talk about that and really get to the root of why they are continually both prospering from experiences born out of an experience and then procreating the resistance. What is going on there? In the meantime, we as Black people must also see these attacks on equity or diversity or inclusion as the continued permission slip to just triple down on being unapologetically Black. And as we go forward, we need to resist these approaches that tell us that, oh, we use a shorthand, they won't know. No, they keep telling us they're going to find out. And when they find out, they use the Supreme Court and other apparatus of the government to roll back whatever other progress we were making at the same time. So this is why, for me, when I talk about reparations, and then shout out to you for bringing up the GI Bill. One of the other pieces of our legislative slate is the GI Restoration Act. Okay. Shout out to Richard Brookshire, who's been leading the Black Veterans Project. That's their signature piece of legislation. And that's another piece of this story, because what we're talking about is that the GI Bill happens and then Black veterans do not receive equal benefits. They're getting that monopoly experience down to the VA can provide 0 down payment houses. You know, it can help you go to college. Black veterans were not getting that in the same degree, which is why intergenerational wealth, even among Black military families, is way different than intergenerational wealth among white military families. Sure. And both of them are serving our country. So what does it mean to have served equally and receive less? That is the dynamic that we're in. And I also want Black people, I feel, to feel completely comfortable in saying that Black people need this. Black people deserve this. Black people have earned this. Like, to be in that and to recognize that it's the steady diet of misinformation that leads other people to hear Black people talk about Black politics and think it doesn't apply to them. Because ultimately, Black politics is all about how do we eliminate subhuman bondage? How do we eliminate human hierarchy? Because it is through us that they created all of that human hierarchy. So when we're talking our Black politics, it's saying human hierarchy is false. There's no such thing. And as long as we keep participating in it, we're reifying the very system that has now people in detention camps, has ICE rolling up into elementary schools, taking children or their families at graduations, has people now, blocking the loop, blocking the 110 freeway. Our experience tells us that it becomes acceptable because we were the original test case. How far can you dehumanize somebody? Let's go to Africa, take people, call them Black, not African, take them across the world and convince the world that they don't have brains the same size, that they have a high pain tolerance and threshold, that they are not honest or truthful, that they don't like working. And that's always crazy to me, that people think that people who are descendants of enslaved people are lazy.
Thank you.
The word slave and lazy don't go together.
Not at all.
In fact, what's interesting is that it only happens to what we think of as Black African people, because the other slaves that we know of were Hebrew slaves. People do not refer to Jews as lazy. They do not refer to Hebrew people as lazy. They think they're hardworking and all these other things. And that's where the anti-Blackness and anti-Africanness shows up. And the last thing I'll say on the whole point about this is that back to the whiteness of it all. Whiteness is the original Ponzi scheme. It is paying less dividends to people, which is why fentanyl, meth, and opioid are at all-time high, because you've been sold a bill of goods and the returns are negative. And so now you're being told, oh, it's because we gave this to these Native Americans, or we gave this to Hispanics, or we gave this to this and that. But equity is always about, even in the story that I love you shared about that experiment, it never said that the person who was getting $200 in both dice, what happened in the equality version was that you took their money and their dice. No, they still got what they had. It was that in Monopoly, the bank had more to give, and that's America. They got the money. It is not, equity does not mean taking something from other individuals. It means making the government accountable for opening up the actual vault that has the money that they know they have.
Wow. You know, one of the things that I try to interject into conversations, and I do get some pushback from people because I recognize that a lot of people are angry and fired up. I even get pushback from white people. Is I try to ensure that whenever we have conversations, that everyone has their humanity. And so I try not to look at white people like monsters. It's very easy to do because a lot of times the most monstrous looking things in history have come from people who wore white skin. But obviously it's not right to paint any race with that broad a stroke. Nor is it right to simply look at one thing or maybe a couple of things that a person or people have done and say that this is all that they are. It's a personal belief, and one that I obviously hold to be true. You made a point earlier that, the United States, effectually what you communicated was that the United States is a relatively young country, certainly relative to, England. And, my belief, and I guess the scientific consensus is that white people are a young people. The oldest people, as you well know, I'm sure, are Black people. And so when we have our approaches, when we forgive white women over and over again for not showing up for themselves and us, when we look at this country and we still believe that this country has its potential to reach, I think it comes from a people who spiritually, on a spiritual level, maybe on a cellular level, are old enough to watch our younger siblings or children, depending on which analogy best suits you, make their mistakes over and over again. And we suffer as a result of it. But we hold that belief that, there's a future that holds equity and ultimately equality for all of us. Now, this is just my belief. And obviously, you're a person that gets into the weeds a lot more. So I want to take a moment while we have you and ask you to share with us a little bit about your book, Radical Reparations, Healing the Soul of a Nation. And I want you to talk about who should be reading it. Obviously, I need to be reading it myself. I'm in the middle of like 3 books right now, but that's definitely on my list and has been since Los Angeles. Because I was like, oh, this guy had to have written a book. And then I found it and I was like, oh, yeah, OK, here we go. So talk to us about this book, who should be reading it, what they're going to get from it. Let folks know the work that you've contributed to the collective knowledge of humanity.
Yeah, thank you for that. Radical Reparations is my aim was to honor, there are 5 people at the front of the book who I thank: my teacher in college, the legendary, powerful ancestor Manning Marable, Derek Bell, who I never got to learn from, but Faces at the Bottom of the Well is the grandfather of Radical Reparations. If that book was not written, I would not have a template for what I decided to be up to. The one and only philosopher, sociologist, Octavia Butler, Parable of the Sower, very deeply important. And the other two people, one of my oldest friends, Medina Johnson, she passed away before she turned 41 years old in 2021, suddenly. And my father, who died on Labor Day from a heart attack in 2020, because he taught me so much about Black people, about Black men, and also about standing on what they say now is business, but also standing for what's right. And so I did effectively about 2 decades worth of research. And I thought, okay, this will be like an academic book. I'll show all of the documents, I'll, do all of this other stuff. But as I started to be a student of the reparations space, and shout out to all of the reparations warriors like Dreesen Heath, Dr. Tiffany Crutcher, Dr. Ron Daniels, and Kichi Taifa, and so many other people who welcomed me into the space where I could just learn and see what was going on. I realized that from the position I have as a professor and academic, my job is to educate, and I have some level of authority in when I present education. And I thought, rather than just having people read documents or something that's academic, how do I do what Miss Lauryn Hill says, flip a negative into a positive picture, where reparations tends to be a negative conversation. People are like, I don't like it, I don't support it, never gonna happen, not possible, never, those are the words usually associated with it. So I thought, how do I disarm people from picking up something that is by a professor and they think maybe like I have to have a degree or go to school in order to access this. And so effectively what I decided to do and how the book is written is it opens when I was doing research in the United Kingdom. I wound up in a small town where there is a young Black kid buried there since the late 1700s. He was believed to be from Nigeria, anywhere between age 9 and 11. I'm there as a part of a BBC production that a friend poet, Sue Andy, out of Manchester, was taking folks on a tour of it. And so I'm just there as like a witness. And I got really curious, like, what is this all white town that has this memorial for this little Black kid? And I then start the book by speculating on how he got there. Where was he from? And where my mind went as I started thinking in real time about how this gravesite winds up being there. And then I take you into that experience of what I did. And then I tell everyone, basically, we're going to read 3 parables. The first parable is the parable of Jubilee, South Carolina. Premise is it's 1965, 100 years after 1865. And in this reality, 40 acres and a mule really happened. So it did happen for many people who don't know. It's just that when Andrew Johnson took over after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, the folks who had settled in Georgia and South Carolina, the land was taken away from them.
I know.
I speculate, what if it's 100 years later? They never got the mule, but they got 40 acres. Several people did. And they started with this settlement they called Jubilee, because I felt like that was very Black to me, Jubilee, South Carolina.
Okay.
And by 1965, they're a third the size of South Carolina. And they have an advocate named Miss Geneva Crenshaw, who's the lawyer who would be the kind of lawyer on Derek Bell's shoulder and faces at the bottom of the well. She's their lawyer. Okay. And she has advocated to get them as an independent territory or statehood in the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So you're getting to Jubilee, South Carolina, and the 2 weeks before, it covers 8 days over 2 weeks before Lyndon B. Johnson signs this bill. So you get to see Black people in a whole Black environment advocating. You see some form of reparations. They've gotten spatial repair and other things. The second parable is called the parable of New Jerusalem, Uganda. In 1903, the Zionist Congress unanimously endorsed putting Israel in Uganda. Most people do not know this. There was a man named Theodore Herzl who proposed it. Now, it didn't happen, but what I speculate is 75 years later, and you spend a whole 24-hour period in 1978, the last day of Idi Amin's rule of Uganda. And this settlement is now in flux because the Camp David Accords have happened and Israel is now recognized as a state by Egypt. So people are thinking about fleeing. So you're finding that 24 hours and it's thinking about what if Israel had been in Africa? And part of why I wanted to do that, one, because I wanted to trace out the history and see the possibility, but also to see if we would care globally the way we do about it being in Palestine. Because part of what I want to get at is the anti-African part of what slavery was globally. Sure. And the last one is called the Parable of the People's Republic of South Africa. And it begins when the British slave trade ends, because when I went to Ghana, to Elmina, we went on our whole tour, and then our tour guide says, you know, millions of people pass through here, but there's another slave trade that has no castles, where more Black people have gone through than this European slave trade, and it's the Arab slave trade. And so I went to a deep historical research dive about the Arab slave trade, which still continues today, by the way. And the story begins with two boys and their fathers who are fishermen on the Oba River in Nigeria, who are then all of a sudden attacked and kidnapped by Arab slave traders. And you follow the kids over an epic journey that takes them through the desert to India, and then they find themselves in South Africa, where they rebuild a life. But then apartheid comes, and then you see their descendants dealing with apartheid, post-apartheid. And then the book ends by taking you into the current moment of what's happening now. Because the idea, I think, is that we hear a lot about reparations as a check. And what I want people to understand is that if everything about slavery is true, no check suffices. Yeah. That doesn't mean that you can't compensate financially, but it means that there's a radical form of repair that is owed. And that radical repair represents the piles and piles of injury and damage and harm and trauma. Piles, Piles, political reparations, intellectual reparations, legal reparations, economic reparations, spatial, spiritual, and social reparations. So the book is anchored by these 7 forms. And mind you, I told you, we see 8 different decades. We see 24 hours, 8 times 3 is 24. We see 8 days over 2 weeks, because 8 is the house in astrology numerologically of death, sex, and transformation. Okay. So let's see 8 and 7. So it's a lot of numerology in the book for those who are into that like me. Okay. And I'm using those numbers intentionally because I want people to really think, what if reparations was tomorrow, 2 weeks away? What if it was 24 hours from now? What if it was 200 years from now? To really think about time, because one synonym we get from money is time is money. Okay. So thinking through time and seeing different ways where certain forms of reparations are happening in real time versus not happening. And all you have to bring to that book is your imagination. That's it.
So obviously that's a brilliant way to get people to conceptualize what reparations should perhaps have looked like. and it might even, inspire the thought what it could look like or what it could mean.
Right.
Where do you think, people stand right now in terms of the reparations conversation? Obviously, Trump 2.0 is well underway. There were attacks. Well, I guess I don't want to say first, but originally since 2020, there were attacks on what we call history. They would call it critical race theory. Later, the attacks were on woke, as though being sleep was somehow better. And then now there are attacks on DEI. There's been a violent pushback. I still believe this is an echo of the pushback against Obama winning the election twice. It's the only thing that really makes sense. And it's so deep inside of a lot of folks that voted for this administration twice, some 3 times. It's so deep that I don't think that a lot of people even realize it. That the people that are legitimately not racist people, at least that's how they feel in their heart, they still are afraid of what Black empowerment could look like for them. And they cannot be convinced that they're afraid. And if we could convince them that they're afraid, they would not be convinced that fear is born out of racism. and they've been indoctrinated, and they're human beings, and they're susceptible to that, as are we.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm not trying to say anything that is unkind, but in terms of where the conversation stands today, bring us up to speed as someone who kind of pays attention to this.
Yeah, so recent Pew poll had 77% of Black people support reparations.
Sure.
And so I think about that because that 23% that is not in support also overlaps with the 23% of our own community that supported maybe 3 times the same administration we were just referring to. And also, it's one of those things where we got to get to 100%. I mean, in addition to the fact that as only 12 or 13% of the population, we definitely need another portion to be a part of it. But it's hard to bring people along for something if you're not 100% down with it. So one of my goals always is to combat the steady diet of misinformation that we as Black people receive, because ultimately, if slavery is a fact, it doesn't matter how you feel about reparations, you're just owed it. What you do with it is your business. But that 100% of us are not aligning the fact of slavery with the fact of reparations is a real achievement gap that we have to close. That's very important. At the same time, also, there's a proverb that remixes one from Octavia Butler. I'll say hers first, and then the one that the Spirit helped me to bring forward that I think applies for a lot of groups. So her proverb is the change parable. All that you touch, you change. Okay. All that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. And so part of what happens is people are made to believe and also experience reparations as some form of change. And change makes people very afraid and scared. And then when you start feeding that fear with, horrifying images or misinformation, it starts to make that fear have some sense of evidence, except as my mom always taught me, fear is false evidence appearing real. It's not really based on anything, because ultimately reparations, whether it be a check or I say check plus, it would be the biggest stimulus package that the world has ever seen. Because the very first thing to say is that Black people are, for better and for worse, one of the biggest recyclers of their money in the actual economy, locally, globally. So if the government were to do what it's supposed to do, that would be a net benefit to all these small businesses, big businesses, Fortune 500. It would be a stimulus package in so many ways. The second thing, which brings me to the parable I use in many spaces, is to say, all that you repair, you heal. All that you heal, heals you. The only lasting truth is love. God is love. That this is really about love. That we have to understand that when you repair something, you're healing something. When you heal something, it heals something inside of you. And that's the opportunity that people who are outside of the Black experience, non-Black people, are missing out on because of this steady diet of information. That it's not like white people are having an amazing American experience. That's why they want to, quote, make it great again, because it's not great to them. And the thing that they're not understanding is that if you get to the root invention of America and you fix its original sins or you try to repair it, it necessarily benefits everyone else because the soil was rotten. That's the whole point. You planted a tree in rotten soil, and then people have been eating off of that tree. I have a friend who lives in LA who was telling me about how she had a neighbor who had this abundance of lemons. And so they were giving them all of these lemons, and she made this lemonade. And the lemonade tastes really good, but it was giving everyone an upset stomach afterwards. Or as we say in the culture, the runs, they're running after this lemonade. And she's like, it's lemonade. How is water and some sweetener and lemons? Why am I not feeling it? It's because the person who was growing the lemons had put a tremendous amount of pesticides in the soil so that you have this abundant lemon tree. Got it. And what people don't always understand is that you're eating fruit off the tree, but you're not aware of the pesticides that are feeding this tree, that are making you sick and also need to be dealt with, which gets back to your point about environmental racism, right? So that's the thing that I think people have to get to, is that when you start hearing reparations, what you should hear is stimulus, right? What you should also hear is an opportunity to heal yourself, because when you live in a country where you find out that there is a population of people who are still present, who descend from the most ultimate form of subhuman bondage known to man,
Yeah.
how do
Chattel.
you make peace with that? Then, if you're a homeowner in this country, as many people are, how do you reconcile that this is other people's land? That is for the government to make right. And if they make that right, that makes you being able to be in your property feel more healing and peaceful. Repair that. So repair, usually when people hear about repairs being made, it's a good thing everywhere else. But when we're talking about repairing the Black community, all of a sudden it's like, why? How come? But then at the same time, you're feeding us information about how impoverished we are, how undereducated we are, how not wealthy we are, how all of these other things are, but they're directly aligned with the original story of how we got here and what we have not gotten since we've been here.
Exactly. Your words, they ring so true. Right now I'm in Phoenix, Arizona. So these are the unceded ancestral lands of the Akima O'odham peoples. And that's one of the affirmations that we have to state out loud whenever we gather, because, I'm not just on the radio and doing podcasts and stuff. Like, I'm outside with the bullhorn and I got I'm one of them. You know what I'm saying? I like that. I like being out there with the people. So, that absolutely rings true. But another thing is, obviously, I have to have these sorts of conversations. And I think that, first off, shout out to you, because your acronym game is fantastic. I'm one of those people too. I love a good acronym. So I credit where it's due. Particularly the one about fear, the false evidence appearing real. That's just masterful. But I want to circle back, because while we're here, I think we can give our listeners something that they can use in their conversations. And you've really simplified it, right? So one of the things that I've encountered, and I'd imagine a lot of people encounter this, is when you do have a conversation about reparations, you're absolutely right. People will say, look, how many Black people are 40 million Black people, something like that? And what do we give each of these Black people? What are they owed? They never picked anything. They never were enslaved. But just for the sake of argument, what do we owe these people? And multiply that number by 40 million. Who can pay for that, right? So that's the pushback, more or less, every time you have this conversation. And that's for a person, the lay person, who is not as studied, not as knowledgeable as a person like you, that could be the end of the conversation. But I've always suspected, and I think that you've kind of reignited this suspicion of mine, that there are other ways of paying reparations, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be a check. A check is good. Money helps. There's people. This is capitalism. Money absolutely helps all the time. But money without proper education, money without, X, Y, and Z, is just like hitting the lottery, and not everybody knows what to do with that. So you gave me an acronym, PILES. And I keep thinking about it. So for our listeners that want to take this new knowledge, first off, I want everyone to read the book, okay? Because this is where we are. I absolutely believe that if the government is corrupt, then be ungovernable. I am super duper petty. I love boycotts. I will drive across town. I am that way. I love it. It's like it's getting my power back. I teach my sons this. I demand that my community follow suit, right? But this is another thing here, right? Okay, let me get to it. The book, Radical Reparations, Healing the Soul of a Nation. Read that book, please. Now, in the conversations, for folks that haven't quite got to the book, you mentioned piles. So before folks can get to the book and make all this stuff live in their life, give us an example of each of the piles, like a real world example, so that folks can remember, so that if they end up in a conversation with someone who would push back against the idea of reparations, that they know, hey, reparations can look like this, and this.
Mhm.
And then I think that would help reparations exist beyond just, okay, the government writing a check. So please.
Absolutely. Yeah, a couple of examples I'll use, and I'll start with your land acknowledgement as one. That's a form of social reparations.
Okay.
And one thing that I think we have to get to, because again, I started off by saying I'm blackity black, black on black, that at times, as much as I want to venerate the indigenous and native folks, it also gaslights Black people. Because where are we in it? And so a form of social repair is a labor acknowledgement.
Okay.
I am currently in Washington, D.C. So, for example, we might do a land acknowledgement. We want to acknowledge the Anacostan people as the original caretakers of this land that we call Washington, D.C. We also want to make an acknowledgement that Washington, D.C. was designed and built by enslaved Africans.
Boom.
That's a form of social repair right there.
Okay.
And there's so many places you can go in America where Black people designed and built for free wherever it is that we're sitting right now. Labor acknowledgements are a form of social repair.
Okay.
Another form of repair that I get to, which is the I in the pile, is intellectual repair. So I wrote a piece for USA Today back in 2021 where I used the music industry as a way to talk about intellectual repair. What if we lived in a world where Mama Thornton and so many other people were thought of as inventing rock and roll?
Oh,
Intellectual
property.
Right. Because the thing is that when you give someone credit, like Little Richard, credit, intellectual credit can turn into monetary credit.
Sure.
Because then when you go to this thing like trademark or patent, they want to know who originally invented it. If you have people acknowledging your intellectual credit, you can turn that into monetary credit. So that's you getting money from another source, but just people listing and acknowledging and recording you as such. So intellectual property, the return of it, the crediting of that intellectual property is a form of repair and restitution. The other thing that I really like to get around, especially in the economic part, because even in economic, that might sound like check, right? Another thing that I talk about there is like overnight, Black people could wake up and Experian and TransUnion could all award us an 800 plus credit score overnight, no money exchanged.
Okay.
All of a sudden, you have access to loans and credit you never had access to.
Sure.
You now qualify for a higher rate for a home than you would have qualified for before.
Yeah.
And that costs nothing. So also sometimes it's about getting to certain things where we live in a digital world as well, where there are ways for them to remove our digital debt without giving us an actual check. So creating a debt-free experience for people, creating, for example, in the political space, originally the idea through the Freedmen's Bureau is that there would be a party or representation or advocacy on behalf of recently freed people. Fast forward, we might actually have lived in a three-party system. So it's also opening up the space for us to not always be in the binary of Republican and Democrat, because ultimately enslaved and formerly enslaved people and their descendants are due political representation. Because ultimately, one of the things that is missing from our government was that there was not an infrastructure to provide a pathway to full humanity for formerly enslaved people. How do we get there? That is through politics, policy, elected officials, and representation. What if we lived in a world where there were the regular members of Congress that represent districts, and then if there had been an apportionment of congressional representatives based on the population of African Americans in the United States, that they also then receive representation in Congress, the same way that they sort of do with some of their colonies, like the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, but maybe to a higher degree, right? So thinking about all of those different features. And the other thing that I do with the book is that I also want to encourage the imagination, because I believe when you imagine it, you can manifest it. So I want people to also hear some of what I'm saying and say, maybe that's not it. I think this would be it. I'm with that, because every community has different needs on the ground, but it's to unlock the opportunity for you to expand what you think can repair you, because we can't always tell people what's going to repair them. They have to know for themselves, but they need to know that there are 7 forms that are available to us: spiritual repair, the representation, the re-education of traditional African religions and spiritual practices. Why are we not allowed to know those things? And not only are we not allowed to know those things, they're always treated as a specter of dark magic or anti-Christianism or anti-this, versus these were ancient practices, ancient belief systems that had existed for thousands and thousands of years. Yeah. We deserve to know what those are, and for us to make choices about what we want to do and what rituals we want to practice. Yeah. Those are just some small versions of how we can think about those different kinds of forms in addition to monetary compensation.
I've taken more time than I deserve. I could talk to you all day. I cannot express to you how happy I was to see that you would be willing to come on the show. I think that the affirming that we wanted to talk to you, both Q and myself, and you coming on the show so soon after us getting a chance to witness you in Los Angeles just speaks to the level of intentionality and the intensity of it. I can't let you go without, kind of asking, if there's anything people should be looking forward to, what's next with you. Obviously, Equity Week's taking place right now, and the State of the People Power Tour has its next leg. Anything else people should be, waiting for from you? And then, of course, we're going to need all of your social media so people can plug in and support and all that.
Yeah, I'm at Marcus Anthony Hunter on IG and TikTok. You might not find as much on TikTok because I'm an analog boy in a digital world, but at Marcus Anthony Hunter, marcusanthonyhunter.com as well. And I'm in all of the UCLA listings. Up next for me is actually practicing what I preach, which is demonstrating a form of intellectual repair. My next project is a joint biography of the Luther Vandross and the Whitney Elizabeth Houston, tentatively called Hot Butterflies, the metamorphic lives of Luther Vandross and Whitney Houston. And what I want to do is not only bring them together, because people don't really know that they have deep connections with each other, but also in the process to intellectually repair their legacy, so that we stop thinking about Luther Vandross as a waist size, and also as like a person without a personality without a personhood. And we stop thinking about Whitney Houston as a person with wasteful decisions, and instead as a genius and prodigy, a child star effectively, who then transformed into the person that we know, and also using them as metaphors for the Black experience after the Civil Rights Movement. They're children of a post-civil rights legacy, to see what ceilings they encountered and what ceilings they broke, as a way for us to also see what ceilings we encountered and what ceilings we broke as Black people, and to demonstrate that intellectual reparations is something that we can do as a practice as writers as well.
Well, you are a brilliant mind, and you are a great hero of our time, and I can't thank you enough for coming on to share your insights with us. So thank you. Once again, today's guest is Dr. Marcus Anthony Hunter, UCLA professor, executive director of United by Equity, and the originator of the phrase Black Lives Matter, which Dr. Johns said he had the receipts for, and we didn't even get a chance to get to that, but that is just fantastic. I just love that. And I got the whole story, and I know those who like developed it and championed it into the movement, but you indeed are the originator of the term Black Lives Matter. And that's just the master stroke on a career that is, I just admire so much. So thank you.
You already know. God bless you.
This has been a production of the Black Information Network. Today's show was produced by Chris Thompson. Have some thoughts you'd like to share? Use the red microphone talkback feature on the iHeartRadio app. While you're there, be sure to hit subscribe and download all of our episodes. I'm your host, Ramses Ja, on all social media. And join us tomorrow as we share our news with our voice from our perspective, right here on the Black Information Network Daily Podcast.